Welcome back to Interpretations. I'm Owen Gray. Last time we began a close reading of Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. If you haven't seen the first video in the series, you can check it out here. In part 1, Grandfather's Curse, we met the narrator. We followed him as he began to grapple with the contradictions of his grandfather's life. His grandfather had been considered a model black citizen by the white men of the town, but on his deathbed, he said that all his life he'd been at war with white society. As we'll see, Grandfather's words will haunt the chapter, setting up a clear exploration of race relations in the United States. We also learned about the narrator's personality. He says he was looking for answers, which sets up the expectation that this novel will have elements of the Bildungsroman. We also inferred that he has some degree of double consciousness.
When I was praised for my conduct, I felt a guilt that in some way I was doing something that was really against the wishes of the white folks. That if they had understood, they would have desired me to act just the opposite. That I should have been sulky and mean, and that really would have been what they wanted, even though they were fooled and thought they wanted me to act as I did. It made me afraid that someday they would look upon me as a traitor, and I would be lost.
He also seems to have internalized some white supremacist ideas. As we read this next section, pay attention to these contradictory and self-contradictory elements. Also pay attention to the imagery in this section. It is particularly dense with symbolism. Finally, a content warning before we begin. This next section does have some misogynistic elements, including some descriptions of fantasies of violence against women. It also includes descriptions of anti-black racism. Without further ado, let's get back into interpreting Invisible Man.
It was in the ballroom of the leading hotel. When I got there, I discovered that it was on the occasion of a smoker, and I was told that since I was to be there anyway, I might as well take part in the battle royal to be fought by some of my schoolmates as part of the entertainment. The battle royal came first.
A smoker appears to have been a slang term for an informal gathering of men, and only men, where smoking was permitted. It also appears to have been a term for illegal underground boxing matches, also known as battles royal or battles royale.
All of the town's big shots were there in their tuxedos, wolfing down the buffet foods, drinking beer and whiskey and smoking black cigars.
Now we need to remember we established that this memory likely occurs around the late 1920s or early 1930s. This would have been during the United States Prohibition era, 1920 to 1933. This shows the hypocrisy of white society. They had one set of rules for the poor and the working class, and another set of rules for the elites.
It was a large room with a high ceiling. Chairs were arranged in neat rows around three sides of a portable boxing ring. The fourth side was clear, revealing a gleaming space of polished floor. I had some misgivings over the battle royal, by the way. Not from a distaste for fighting, but because I didn't care too much for the other fellows who were to take part. They were tough guys who seemed to have no grandfather's curse worrying their minds. No one could mistake their toughness.
Here, the narrator reveals something explicit about himself. He feels superior to the, quote, other fellows because they were tough guys without a grandfather's curse worrying their minds. You can read this as the narrator setting up a hierarchy with intelligence, which he has and is recognized for, above physical strength, which the other black teenagers have. He emphasizes this point by calling them tough 2 times in as many sentences. This also supports the idea that the narrator has internalized some degree of white supremacy and the stereotypes of black men as violent and brutish.
And besides, I suspected that fighting a battle royal might detract from the dignity of my speech. In those pre-invisible days, I visualized myself as a potential Booker T. Washington.
The narrator compares himself and aspires to be like Booker T. Washington, one of the two most famous black intellectuals of the post-Reconstruction era. Washington was a vocal advocate for a slow-going, racial uplift approach, an idea that by assimilating to white cultural standards, black people could convince white people to give up their anti-black racist ideas while also avoiding violent anti-black backlash. Now, like the narrator's grandfather, Booker T. Washington actually fought a war against racism on two fronts. While he openly advocated that black people should conform to the dominant white culture, he secretly funded legal challenges against white supremacist policies.
But the other fellows didn't care too much for me either, and there were 9 of them. I felt superior to them in my way, and I didn't like the manner in which we were all crowded together in the servants' elevator. Nor did they like my being there. In fact, as the warmly lighted floors flashed past the elevator, we had words over the fact that I, by taking part in the fight, had knocked one of their friends out of a night's work.
For me, this is a particularly interesting section of the text. The other black teenagers are not angry at the white men, who have the power in this situation to determine who fights and who doesn't. Rather, they're angry at the narrator. White supremacists have always worked to divide people so they could maintain their power. They fomented racist sentiments among poor whites to prevent them from developing class solidarity with poor blacks. Here, it benefits the white men to have the black teenagers divided against each other rather than working in solidarity against their power.
We were led out of the elevator through a rococo hall into an anteroom and told to get into our fighting togs. Each of us was issued a pair of boxing gloves and ushered out into the big mirrored hall, which we entered looking cautiously about us and whispering, lest we might accidentally be heard over the noise of the room. It was foggy with cigar smoke, and already the whiskey was taking effect. I was shocked to see some of the most important men of the town quite tipsy. They were all there. Bankers, lawyers, judges, doctors, fire chiefs, teachers, merchants, even one of the more fashionable pastors.
We see here that all elements of society are aligned to oppress the black teenagers, though I have to say I am surprised that the police are not mentioned explicitly. I have the temptation to begin hunting for allegory here, but I think a literal reading is more accurate. In an allegory, one character represents a historical person, a social class, or an idea. Think of the 3 pigs in Orwell's Animal Farm, for example, who represented Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. I think Ellison is simply stating that all the people who have some degree of power in society are complicit in the maintenance of a white supremacist hierarchy. I think that the fact that the narrator includes one of the more fashionable pastors helps to strengthen the inference I made in the first video that the narrator is questioning the role of religion in Black lives. I know it's ahistorical, but I can't help but think of a James Baldwin interview from 1968 whenever I read this passage. He says that there's a black church and a white church, and the most segregated hour in America is high noon on Sundays. I also think about Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail from 1963. He addressed it to white clergy and rabbis who were against his coming to Birmingham. The white clergy argued for a gradual reform of the racist system rather than its abolition. He famously wrote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." Now, as a teacher myself, I have to admit I'm upset to see teachers on this list, but on the other hand, it makes sense. Teaching the prescribed curriculum can reinforce the existing power structure. For generations, teachers have taught false narratives about American history. Columbus discovered America. The Pilgrims and the Indians were friends. George Washington could never tell a lie, etc. And there are teachers teaching today who repeat racist ideas about, quote, those kids, and who still believe that Black and Latinx children are less interested in education than their white and Asian counterparts. On May 13th of this year, Lisa Kelly published an essay on Medium calling out moderate teachers, echoing, I think, King's white moderate, for perpetuating inequalities in the system. And while I could go on, let's get back to what Ellison has to say.
Something we could not see was going on up front. A clarinet was vibrating sensuously, and the men were standing up and moving eagerly forward. We were a small, tight group, clustered together, our bare upper bodies touching and shining with anticipatory sweat. While up front, the big shots were becoming increasingly excited over something we still could not see. Suddenly, I heard the school superintendent, who had told me to come, yell, "Bring up the shines, gentlemen! Bring up the little shines!" We were rushed up to the front of the ballroom, where it smelled even more strongly of tobacco and whiskey. Then we were pushed into place. I almost wet my pants. A sea of faces, some hostile, some amused, ringed around us, and in the center, facing us, stood a magnificent blonde, stark naked.
This feels like another place where Ellison could introduce playing with stereotypes about Black men. A lot of racist actions have been taken, claiming that the white men were protecting the white women from Black men. Here, the white men in power are setting a trap for the Black teenagers.
There was dead silence. I felt a blast of cold air chill me. I tried to back away, but they were behind me and around me. Some of the boys stood with lowered heads, trembling. I felt a wave of irrational guilt and fear. My teeth chattered, my skin turned to gooseflesh, my knees knocked. Yet, I was strongly attracted, and I looked in spite of myself. Had the price for looking been blindness, I would have looked. The hair was yellow, like that of a circus Cupid doll, the face heavily powdered and rouged, as though to form an abstract mask, the eyes hollow and smeared a cool blue, the color of a baboon's butt. I felt a desire to spit upon her as my eyes brushed slowly over her body.
There's so much going on in this section of text. Now, I understand the narrator's attraction on a literal level, that of a heterosexual male attracted to a woman. If there's a symbolic level to the attraction at this point, I don't quite understand it. He has to understand the danger of looking. White men have used Black men being attracted to white women as a pretense for committing violence for more than a century. The Tulsa anti-Black massacre of 1921, for example, was at least partially set off by an allegation that a 19-year-old male Black teenager assaulted a 17-year-old white female teenager. And the way that he describes the woman, it's just repulsive. He objectifies her by first comparing her to objects, a circus Cupid doll and a mask, and then he dehumanizes her by comparing her to a baboon's butt. He feels attraction and repulsion, which is another example of those contradictory statements, and shows a level of internalized misogyny here.
Her breasts were firm and round as the domes of East Indian temples, and I stood so close as to see the fine skin texture and the beads of pearly perspiration glistening like dew around the pink and erected buds of her nipples. I wanted, at one and the same time, to run from the room, to sink through the floor, or to go to her and cover her from my eyes and the eyes of the others with my body, to feel the soft thighs, to caress her and destroy her, to love her and murder her, to hide from her, and yet to stroke where below the small American flag tattooed upon her belly, her thighs formed a capital V. I had a notion that of all in the room, she saw only me with her impersonal eyes.
Now we have to stop and reevaluate the entire section of the text in light of the detail of the small American flag tattooed upon her belly. The woman is not draped in the American flag. She's not wearing red, white, and blue. The American flag is literally a part of her skin. This adds a symbolic layer to everything that came before. This woman is the spirit of white America, or the spirit of the white American dream personified. It's common in art history for nations to be depicted as goddess. I think of, for example, the painting American Progress by John Gast from 1872, which depicts American manifest destiny. Looking back at the text, the white men are pushing the black teenagers to look at this symbol of white America. Some are hostile, some are amused, and this suggests that the white men know that the white American dream is out of reach for the black teenagers, and yet they are dangling it out in front of them from cruelty. Some of the black teenagers look away because they know that they will be punished for desiring the white American dream, and also that it's unattainable. One thing I find interesting is the multiple ways you can read the narrator gazing at the woman while the other black teenagers look away. One interpretation is that, although the narrator feels superior to the other black teenagers, he cannot help himself from looking, which suggests that either he does not believe the racial limits apply to him, or that he is blind to the racism he experiences, which might make sense given that he's been praised as the model black citizen by the white townspeople. Another interpretation is that he's somehow braver than the other teenagers, and maybe believes in black liberation, whereas the other teenagers, while not exactly content, know and have accepted their place in the racial hierarchy, and have internalized the limits placed on them by the white men. Now, if the woman represents America, we can read the narrator's complex emotional reactions as speaking to how black folk have felt about America through history. He represents the convoluted history of race and racism, and his ancestors' various reactions all bubbling up inside him.
And then she began to dance. A slow, sensuous movement. The smoke of 100 cigars clinging to her like the thinnest of veils. She seemed like a fair bird girl, girdled in veils, calling to me from the angry surface of some gray and threatening sea. I was transported.
The references to a clarinet playing, and these references here to veils, have always called to my mind the image of either a snake charmer or a belly dancer. Of those, I think the snake charmer is a more resonant image because it has a level of danger that a belly dancer does not necessarily have. The second reference to a bird girl and the angry surface of some gray and threatening sea actually evokes the sirens of Homer's Odyssey. Although the sirens have been depicted as mermaid-like since the Middle Ages, they were originally depicted as birds with the heads of women, much like harpies. So America holds a siren-like song for the narrator and the other black teenagers and threatens to lead them to ruin if they follow it. This makes the idea of the snake charmer even more resonant for me because both of them imply danger.
Then I became aware of the clarinet playing and the big shots yelling at us. Some threatened us if we looked, and others if we did not.
This sentence echoes the earlier sentence, a sea of faces, some hostile, some amused, when the blonde was first introduced.
On my right, I saw one boy faint. And now a man grabbed a silver pitcher from a table and stepped close as he dashed ice water upon him and stood him up and forced 2 of us to support him as his head hung and moans issued from his thick, bluish lips. Another boy began to plead to go home. He was the largest of the group, wearing dark red fighting trunks, much too small to conceal the erection which projected from him as though in answer to the insinuating, low-registered moaning of the clarinet. He tried to hide himself with his boxing gloves.
It has always struck me as important that the narrator points out that the boy who wants to go home is the largest of the group. His size, his physical strength are of no help to him in this situation. He is at the mercy or the cruelty of the white men. This next scene coming up verges on the allegorical in my opinion. Pay attention to the details and the descriptions as I read the next section.
And all the while the blonde continued dancing, smiling faintly at the big shots who watched her with fascination, and faintly smiling at our fear. I noticed a certain merchant who followed her hungrily, his lips loose and drooling. He was a large man who wore diamond studs and a shirt front, which swelled with the ample paunch underneath. And each time the blonde swayed her undulating hips, he ran his hand through the thin hair of his bald head, and, with his arms upheld, his posture clumsy like that of an intoxicated panda, wound his belly in a slow and obscene grind. This creature was completely hypnotized. The music had quickened. As the dancer flung herself about with a detached expression on her face, the men began reaching out to touch her. I could see their beefy fingers sink into the soft flesh.
These sentences have always struck me as a condemnation of capitalist greed. The capitalists are trying to sink their fingers into America on both the literal and the symbolic level. The capitalist has already been described as having too much. The diamond studs on his shirt front reflect his accumulation of wealth, and his paunch shows that he has more than enough to eat. If left unchecked, the capitalist class will rape America.
Some of the others tried to stop them, and she began to move around the floor in graceful circles as they gave chase, slipping and sliding over the polished floor. It was mad. Chairs went crashing, drinks were spilt, as they ran laughing and howling after her. They caught her just as she reached a door, raised her from the floor, and tossed her as college boys are tossed at a hazing, and above her red, thick-smiling lips, I saw the terror and disgust in her eyes, almost like my own terror and that which I saw in some of the other boys.
Here we have another instance where the narrator is comparing him to someone else. In this case, he is like America. He is terrified of the power that the white men have and is disgusted by the system that keeps him in a subordinate position. He recognizes that he is seen as an object, an exploitable resource, by the white men.
As I watched, they tossed her twice, and her soft breasts seemed to flatten against the air, and her legs flung wildly as she spun. Some of the more sober ones helped her to escape. And I started off the floor, heading for the anteroom with the rest of the boys. While I was workshopping this video with a female friend, she pointed out that I recreated the white men's objectification of the white woman. I reduced her down to a symbol. I still have work that I need to do to make sure my own readings are not oppressive. And that's the end of part 2, the pre-fight entertainment. Thank you so much for watching. Join me next week for part 3, the Battle Royal. If you liked this video, please give it a like, and if you disliked it, give it a dislike. I look forward to reading and responding to your comments below. If you think someone would enjoy this reading, please share it on social media. If you like the work that I'm doing, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/owenxgrey. You can follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/owenxgrey or on Facebook at facebook.com/owenxgrey. And again, thank you for watching, and until next time, keep interpreting.